Broadcasting live from Forward Observer Central Command in Austin, Texas. It's the man always out front on the issues. You're listening to Out Front with Mike Shelby.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Out Front. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. I started reading, listen, no shout outs or shout downs today. I'm just going to tell you about a new book I started last night. It is called All Societies Die. Okay, very appropriate for the show. All Societies Die, How to Keep Hope Alive. That's a new turn of events here. It's hope. So right off the bat, listen, first of all, I'm not that impressed by this book so far. I'm only a few chapters in. However, we need to distinguish between societies and empires. The name of this book is All Societies Die. In this book, Samuel Cohn tends to, I think, he tends to conflate. He uses them interchangeably, at least, societies with empires, and societies and empires and civilizations. And I think all three of those things are different. Now, Cohn points to Rome, the Roman Empire, Roman society lasting about 900 years. Now, as a society, that may be true, but what we know that may be true of what we know about Roman society. But as an empire, you can chop that up. Pax Romana, for instance, only lasted for 200 years, maybe 270 years, and this is an important distinction. And so, in that regard, American society, quote unquote, American society, may last much longer than the American Empire, just like the British Empire. British society still exists. The British Empire does not. Their empire ended sometime between maybe the early 1940s, 1945, and 1956. The Suez Canal crisis was by the very end of their empire. And so, but Britain, Great Britain is kind of a husk of its former empire. The United States may be the same. We have a lot more going for us here in the United States. Number one, we have vast natural resources, a lot of natural wealth in this country. But my point is, I do think that the American empire, as we know it, is coming to an end. We may begin a new, Pax Americana is coming to an end. We may become something more of the later in the life of the Roman Empire or Roman society, where you had civil wars, the Barracks Wars, lots of wars that came after, lots of wars that came before Caesar as well. At any rate, on that topic, before we get into this book, there were a couple comments, people saying, well, America's not an empire. Well, I absolutely disagree. We need to define empire, first of all. And in layman's terms, I think an empire is a group of territories or a group of nations that exists under one sovereign authority. And we can look at the expansion of the American empire, essentially from the founding of the colonies in the early 1600s, and then you get expansion into areas where Native American tribes exist. So across the Ohio River and into the Ohio River Valley, there's the French and Indian Wars. And then southward into the lands of Cherokee and Choctaw and the Chickasaw and the Creek and all the other Indian tribes of the Southeast. And then came the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, about 20 years after that, roughly. You get Manifest Destiny in 1845. And that's where the American Empire really began pushing westward over the Comanche and Arapaho, the Cheyenne, all the way to the West Coast. And these two concepts, the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny, became the basis for conflict in, well, I was beginning to say in the several decades that followed. However, they absolutely continued after several decades. Because in 1946, we marched into Mexico City, and that, among other things, forced them to cede the Southwest to the American Empire. Also, we got involved in a series of small wars before that, just after the turn of the 20th century. You may have heard former President Teddy Roosevelt refer to the United States or the American Empire as an international police power. He deployed U.S. Marines during the Santo Domingo affair. Also, U.S. forces would be deployed to Nicaragua in 1911, to Haiti in 1915, and to a number of other countries during this period of time known as the Banana Wars. Before that, we fought the Spanish, and they ceded the Philippines to the United States. It was a U.S. territory. American forces occupied, retained control over that government in the Philippines from 1902 until 1946. Guam became a U.S. territory in 1898, the same year that Puerto Rico did, I believe. And the colonization of Hawaii started in 1778, and Hawaii became a U.S. state in 1959. So nobody, absolutely nobody, I think, can tell me that the American Empire is not, or that the United States is not an empire, because our power and influence has spanned the globe for some time. Now, with that, let's get back into this book. For those of you coming in just a couple minutes late here, All Societies Die, How to Keep Hope Alive. I'm not recommending this book yet. Like I said, I'm not impressed. However, there are some important things to talk about. By the way, we're going to have plenty of time, I think, for Q&A on the show. I didn't have, first of all, I haven't finished reading this book, and I've been working on tomorrow's economic early warning briefing over at Forward Observer. So I did not get a chance to produce a full 30 minutes of material for today. All right, let's talk about Western civilization, because in this book, author Samuel Cohn dates the West to 1350, and that puts us at about 670 years old. He says 650 years is about an average lifespan for an empire. I beg to differ. I think John Glubb is absolutely right. 650 years, maybe that's the average lifespan of a civilization. I don't think that's the lifespan of an empire, which lasts about 10 generations or 250 years. And Sir John Glubb in The Fate of Empires, I think, really drives that point home. It's a quick read. It's more of an essay. It's like 20 or 30 pages long. It's worth the read. Sir John Glubb, Fate of Empires. But Samuel Cohn here does make one good point, and that is the collapse of the Roman Empire led to the Middle Ages, to the Dark Ages. The collapse of the Chinese dynasties, he writes, led to periods that the Chinese refer to as the periods of warring states. And those states warred until if they fought against each other until a new dynasty reestablished power. The fall of the ancient Egyptian society, he writes, ended with chaos, a period of chaos. And so historically, civilizational collapse leads to poverty. It leads to an increase in crime and tribal warfare. That includes maybe what you call domestic warlords, certainly tribal warlords, also historically invading armies, which may not be a problem for the United States, because we have two oceans that I don't think. Some people have asked, well, don't you think the Chinese will invade the United States if the American empire collapses? And I still think the answer is no. I don't think they will. So at any rate, one of the interesting parts in this book he's talking about what happens when an economy collapses. And he just briefly mentions this, but he talks about the banditry. And banditry leads to a decline in economic activity because it's difficult and it's expensive to protect your trade routes. It's protect them from bandits. And so this is a problem I've talked about before. There are a lot of people who maybe they call themselves collapsitarians. Maybe they think there's going to be an apocalyptic collapse, some catastrophic collapse of the United States, like an EMP or grid down or into a Mad Max scenario. That's not my baseline. I don't think that's impossible. But if you do think that is, I've heard a lot of people say, well, you're going to have to resort to bartering. Well, I hope you have a plan. If you believe this is going to happen, I hope you have a plan to protect these bartering networks or to protect these trading hubs or whatever you have pictured in your mind. I hope you have the ability to protect the local economic trade, because if you do not, then in this environment, you should be expecting lots of bandits. And so if you don't have the ability to protect economic trade, you will not have economic activity. So I think that's a very important point. Now, probably 6 or 8 years ago, I read, I think it's Joseph Tainer. he wrote a book called The Collapse of Complex Societies. And I'm going to read that book next because he discusses in great detail civilizational collapse. And I do wonder whether here in the United States, given the, I would say, moral and ethical moral decay that we see in not just American culture, but also, I should say, American pop culture, but also Western culture in general. And look, Oswald Spengler was writing about this in the early 1900s when he wrote The Decline of the West. And so I do wonder if we, by the way, Decline of the West, volumes 1 and 2, and I do wonder whether we're facing not just the collapse of the American empire, but also collapse of the West, or the death of the West, as Pat Buchanan wrote back in 2002. By the way, I don't think the collapse of the American empire is imminent. There's a case, I see a small chance for there to be some catastrophic, show-stopping, immediate collapse of the American empire. Otherwise, I think it's going to happen slowly, 20 to 40 years. Or if it does happen quickly, it could be due to hyperinflation. It could be due to a war with China. We know these wars tend to be economically devastating, not just for both sides, not just for all belligerents, but really the entire world. And if the United States and China does get into a war, I think it will be Pyrrhic. But it occurs to me that economic strength is kind of like and this is what bothers me so much about what the Fed is saying versus what the Fed is doing. Economic strength, I tend to think of this as like a gyroscope, right? You know those little gyroscopes, and it's got that little disc in the middle, and you can spin it. And as long as that disc is spinning in the middle, you can kind of tap it here and there, and it'll wobble, but it'll stay upright. And then eventually, there's just so much force, it starts to run out of steam, and then that thing just topples over. So my concern is that once that thing topples over, it takes an incredible amount of force. You have to lift the thing up and respin it. Okay. Well, in economic terms, that's a lot of force to get that economy back up and running. And I'm not positive. Listen, Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman, came out the other day, earlier this week, and he said, I may have mentioned this on the show, or maybe it was last week. He said, the economy we're going to have in the United States in the near future, I'm paraphrasing here, the economy we're going to have in the United States in the near future is not going to be like the economy we had prior to COVID. And he said, I don't know what this new economy will look like. Maybe he's talking about stagflation. Maybe he's talking about something worse. I don't know. But I go back to this gyroscope and how much pressure is being exerted on our economy right now, and just through really bad monetary policy, maybe it could topple over. The problem is, and Samuel Cohn talks about this in the front part of the book here, the first few chapters, and lots of other people have talked about this too. When the economy collapses, in a civilizational collapse, you also get a collapse in technical innovation. And quality of medical care goes down, and all the other things that propel a society to prosperity, they also are degraded, which is why we tend to get decades or centuries of quote unquote dark ages after these civilizations and empires and societies collapse. So I'm only a few chapters into this book, All Societies Die, but I can tell you he seems to borrow a lot from Sir John Glubb's Fate of Empires. He uses almost some of the same terminology. For instance, he said economic power leads to military power. That's kind of a core tenet of Sir John Glubb's theory on the fate of empires. I don't think it's plagiarism, and so far Cohn presumably has done a lot of original research. But I would just say that Sir John Glubb does a far better job at describing the collapse of empires so far than Samuel Cohn does. Another interesting point of this book, he's talking about what happened in the Byzantine Empire. By the way, I'll go through your comments and questions here at the end of the show. But he's talking about the Byzantine Empire, and I'll just bring up again, I think Samuel Cohn tends to conflate empires and societies, and they're not the same thing, and it kind of bugs me. It's like one of those all empires are societies, but not all societies are empires kind of thing. At any rate, it bugs me. But one of the things that the Byzantines did, this is interesting, when they conquered a new territory, they would get all the new artisans, okay, the people who made things, the producers, we might call them manufacturers today. They would take all the artisans of that territory and force relocate them to the interior of the Byzantine Empire. And in this way, they kind of built up what we would call today an industrial base. And they took all the producers, they put them into the interior of the Byzantine Empire. And in that way, they protected them from foreign incursions. And I thought that was interesting. Now, all that was happening, things were going relatively okay until, roughly, he doesn't go deep into the history of the Byzantine Empire. But you get to this guy named Basil II. And he writes, the Byzantine Empire, they had this concept of social equality. Now, prior to this, the way that, and he really doesn't even go into exactly what social equality meant in the book, but so far he seems to say that property rights were respected. And so what happened is the way that the emperor encouraged armies to go out and fight and expand territory is they would get part of the loot and plunder that they got from defeating these new people on lands that they conquered. And when the armies lost them, they had to be paid basically out of the treasury. But under this dude named Basil II, and he ruled from 976 to 1075, he started paying off the nobles to fight. He'd basically get them to fight for free because he would say, basically, I'll give you a tax credit, or I'll relieve you of your taxes. You're not going to have to pay taxes if you go and fight. And so, as you can see, he started to erode the tax base. And then what's worse is that when these armies went and fought and they lost, they didn't get enough loot or plunder to pay the armies. Then he said, well, you can start taking land from the peasants. Okay, so now we're violating principles of private property, which I think is the basis of a functioning society. One of the maybe several bases of a functioning society. So as you can see, he quickly eroded the tax base. And he also allowed these war leaders, because when they took the land from the peasants, they also amassed their own power. They had these massive estates. And if they didn't want to pay the taxes, then they didn't do it. So they began to accrue a lot of power and a lot of influence as well. And as a result, Samuel Cohn writes, quote, civil wars and regional uprisings flourished. Because what happened is these war leaders, as they amassed more land and the allegiance of more people, they became independently powerful, which led to civil wars. And maybe you can see where I'm going with this. And over time, this degraded the strength of the Byzantine Empire, and then it ultimately led to gains from several ethnic nations within the empire who were basically fighting for their independence or fighting these civil wars. Now, here's another book. I pulled this off my shelf. I read this Sorry, gang. Listen, I don't know why the internet just sporadically cuts out. Maybe it's the Russians or the Chinese, or maybe it's NSA. I don't know. But look, there's another book called Why Nations Fail. This is a fantastic book. This is one of my favorite books. It is so good. It is so incredibly good. One of the biggest reasons why nations fail is because of extractive economies. This is where the government pulls all the value out of the economy, and they reduce the incentive to work. In this book, Darren Acemoglu writes in one of these chapters, this is one of the things hopefully I will never forget, but probably will never forget because I've told the story many times. He writes about in the Congo, when the Belgians entered the Congo, what they found was very, of course, modern agriculture. Then, of course, it was antiquated. But they found that in the Congo, these people weren't even using the wheel. And we've heard a lot of people say that, the Africans didn't even invent the wheel. And according to Acemoglu, that's not true. In the Congo, they knew what the wheel was, but nobody used the wheel to improve their agricultural yields because they had to give everything up to the Congolese king. And when you died, if you're a farmer, you basically a peasant, you're working the land. When you died, you weren't able to pass the land on to your first son, or you weren't able to divide it among your children. And it went back to the king. And then the king used that land to buy off other essentially nobles, or to buy the allegiance from new people. And so there was absolutely zero incentive whatsoever to improve the output of your land. And so at any rate, he talks about this, which I thought was interesting. But why nations die is typically, and also they talk about the Soviet Union and how the Soviet Union collapsed, which is, I think it was Time magazine did this big profile back in the 60s or 70s. And they said, oh, wow, look, the Soviet system really works. They're getting like 30% or 50% annual economic growth from this centralized economic system. Oh, how great and wonderful Soviet communism is. It's such an economic powerhouse. And yeah, when you remove wealth, when you remove value from the economy, it works for a period of time. And was it Margaret Thatcher said the problem with socialists is they eventually run out of other people's money? Well, that's exactly what happened to the Soviet Union. And that's what this whole book is about, why nations fail. When governments have really bad economic policies, they run their countries into the ground, and you get state failure. And we know this from the English Civil War, for instance. We know that in the lead up to the English Civil War, the finances of the crown were so bad, he had to actually take the king then had to actually take out loans from the aristocracy. He had to sell off land and possessions of the crown to continue to finance the government. And ultimately, that was one of the things that led to the English Civil War in the 1650s. I guess I'll have to look that back up. Is it? I don't know. I want to say it's like 1640 or somewhere around there. At any rate, nothing good. Absolutely nothing good comes from having bad economic policies if you are a country. And the larger your country is, let's say an empire, the worse it will be, because you absolutely do risk collapse. So that's where I've gotten so far. I've gotten to how the first society died. I've not gotten yet to how to keep hope alive, but I'm hoping that part of the book is better than the first part. So with that, by the way, this is from Cornell University Press. And I will probably do this. Listen, I buy a lot of books because I read a lot of books, and they sent me an email some time ago, and I don't even know if this is true, but they said I was in the top 1% of all buyers of books from Cornell University Press. And they sent me a special discount code. And I'll put that up on Patreon in case anyone's interested in using it. All right. Well, let's move on to some questions, because this is as far as I've gotten into the book. And if Ben, if you can help me look for questions, then we'll spend a few minutes going over these. I'll also look as well. By the way, someone commented yesterday that said, I don't think America is an empire. And I don't think I don't see that at all. And I try to keep an open mind. And I guess I shouldn't tell this person that he or she is wrong. I do think America is an empire, and we know that they typically last for about 250 years or 10 generations. And I fully expect in my lifetime to see the end of the American empire. Let's see. Hang on. Let me expand this. Could the economy be more fragmented with more local? Hang on, Ben. Can you pop that back up, please? Could the economy be more fragmented with more local trading of local goods rather than anything nationally organized? I don't know. Can you rephrase that question? I guess I don't really understand it. One thing I would recommend everyone do, we keep saying this. Listen, India is increasing their coal imports. So the second largest coal importer in the world, behind China. Coal prices are going to go up. Oil and gas, natural gas prices probably still going up. So as much as possible, you need to be, and I think in order to do well for the next 20 years, one of the things you need to do is just become as self-sufficient and as resilient as you can. And if you can't do everything by yourself, that means you must build a local community, build a local tribe, and do it that way. For instance, if you don't have land with any trees on it, or there's no way for you to go to this national forest, whatever, and collect deadfall. Well, I mean, that's something you should figure out in your local community. Find someone who can provide that stuff and really make your supply, just like China's doing. China's regionalizing and localizing their supply chain for a reason. And we hear all these big names coming out and say the end of globalization is upon us, or at least globalization is now going in reverse. Well, I think there's a fair lesson to be learned here, and that is your supply chain needs to be as local as possible as well. And by the way, I just saw where Tyson Foods, the Tyson CEO, apparently testified in front of a congressional panel today. His name's Donnie King, and he said that the port in Shanghai is so backed up in China that they've had to redirect cargo ships that are container ships that are carrying their chicken and go sell it to other countries or go put it in other ports. When China does open back up, and just like we saw last year, we just see this massive volume of container ships and tankers and bulkers coming across the Pacific for the ports on the West Coast, and we see this massive backlog again. We're going to run into the same problem. So you should localize your supply chain as much as possible. Ben, if you can please put the questions into the chat so I can see them, and we'll maybe do a couple other questions here. Ben Tired says Empire of the Summer Moon. Now, I have that book, but I have not read it. It says Empire of the Summer Moon is a good book about the fall of the Comanche. Okay. Would you argue that events in California, like the mass store and train robberies, are the beginnings of the rise of banditry? What concerns me, I mean, maybe that is the rise of, I don't think it's the rise of banditry, the beginnings of the rise of banditry. I think it's an expansion of existing banditry. And it is concerning, because this is becoming a cultural problem. When we see a group of teens, minority urban youths predominantly, go into a Walgreens or a CVS or a Target or a Walmart, and there's 10 of them, there's 50 of them, who knows, and they just go in there and they just start swiping things that they want, and they put it in their bag, they put it in a shirt, and there's too many of them to catch. And it's become so bad in San Francisco that, wasn't it Target, or maybe it was Walgreens and CVS, they actually started closing stores down in San Francisco. They just said, we can't do it anymore. We're losing too much inventory to these, I don't know if they call them flash mobs or what they call them. So, when that becomes culturally ingrained, when that becomes a common practice, yes, that is highly alarming to me as an analyst, because unless there's something that disrupts that from being the norm, just like we saw during the just like we can read during the Qin dynasty in China. Sorry, listen, my brain works about twice as fast as my mouth. I have like a super high speed processor, but my internet is very slow. My internet upload speed is very slow. So sorry if I stumble over my words here. But the problem is, we can read about the Qin dynasty when the Chinese peasants began to defect from the peasantry in order to be bandits, because it was more economically feasible for them. They lived a better life as bandits than they did as peasants. By the way, if you're an American taxpayer, you are the peasant. If you're in the middle class, you are the peasant in this situation. And so, yes, I am concerned when I start to see members of the peasantry break away and engage more in banditry, because that was one of the major drivers of the factionalizing of the elites in the Qin dynasty, which ultimately led to basically civil war and state collapse there, elites and anti-elites, which I think I talked about yesterday. All right, next question. If empires last 250 years on average, with China's demographic problems, could they last only 50 years? Well, I'm not sure that I'm willing to say that China is an empire. Now, there have been dynasties which have ruled China, but I guess there are ethnic minorities in China. I don't know that I would call China an empire. They're not like the Imperial Japanese. At least I haven't seen, not yet. Now, if China starts taking over new territory, then maybe we call them an empire. So I don't know, but I do think that China has major demographic problems. In the rise of the banditry, when financiers stop funding ventures that generate wealth. Is the rise of banditry when financiers stop funding ventures that generate wealth, like new businesses, and start consumptive investing, for instance, buying residential real estate. I don't know that I would call that. I don't know that I would call that banditry. It is something else. I haven't considered what you might call this on like a financier or an investor or / hedge fund / BlackRock level. I don't know that that's banditry. I think that is the elites, the establishment elites like BlackRock, trying to build a moat. And I think that's more feudalism at work than banditry. I think that is probably modern day feudalism. Building a rentier society when you have the elites owning more and more of the homes that are available, and you have more of the middle class, especially younger people who are not in a position to buy a home. And that absolutely is done on purpose. At least if you're BlackRock, it's done on purpose because, and I saw this video on 60 Minutes a few months ago, and it's this company based out of Toronto. Listen, one of the massive problems we have in this country is that foreigners are allowed to own so much property. And one of the things that's really driving home prices up is because these very wealthy people in these other countries like China, they don't want to put their money in their own country. It's not safe in their own country. It might be confiscated. Their wealth, their real estate might be expropriated. So where they put in somewhere that has very strong private property laws, like the United States. And we know that foreign, quote unquote, foreign investment, foreign ownership of farmland, especially farmland and homes, drives up the cost of Americans, drives up home housing costs for Americans. And I think that's a travesty. This should not be happening in the United States, but it is. And I think that's more of rentier society. I think that's more of elites building a moat for themselves more than banditry. With the current ethnic makeup of the United States, could this boil down to a giant Yugoslav civil war here in the continental United States? Okay, that's another good question. Now, this will be the last question I do here for today. Thanks, by the way, for tuning in. And lots of good questions. I hope you think what I have to provide is valuable. Now, in Yugoslavia, you had multiple different factions and religions, multiple different ethnicities and religions. You had the Bosniaks, Muslim Bosnians. You had the Croats. You had the Serbs. I think maybe there's one or two other in there. And I don't know. I don't think that I don't think American society is that factionalized. It's not like we have the Germans and the Scots-Irish fighting each other, in the United States. Maybe they did in New York, like Gangs of New York movie, but I don't think it's quite that bad in the United States, because what has happened is, well, first of all, religion is becoming less and less important in American society. Like the number of churchgoers is going down. For Caucasians, they don't see themselves as predominantly German first. They they'll say, "Oh, I'm Orthodox, Greek Orthodox Catholic first, or I'm Roman Catholic first." Most of the whites in this country are just they're white first. They're white. That's their. Uh, it should be. It should. Well, let me rephrase this. One of the problems that I do see in the United States is that we have not just primary allegiances or primary identities, like I am an American, but now we have a nationality allegiance to the nation being eroded, and we're getting secondary and tertiary allegiances. Now it's like, oh, I'm on the left. They call this intersectionality, right? Your racial, your gender, or whatever. So this is one of the things. And if you subscribe to the fourth generation warfare theory, this is what Bill Lynn talks about, where people start to prioritize other identities ahead of their national identity. And I think it is a problem in the United States. I know there are people, my final comment on this here is, I know there are people who believe that the United States is going to balkanize like Yugoslavia did. And they say it's going to be just as brutal as Yugoslavia was. I personally don't think that's going to be the case. But in another 5 or 10 years, if we have hyperinflation at some point, we have much worse economic conditions. Yeah, I think it could get quite bad. It's just not my baseline scenario. And so I hope that helps. All right. Well, that's going to do it for today's show, everybody. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks so much. If you like what I do, you like the topics, if they interest you, please do share this show with a friend. You can pass them the YouTube channel link or pass them the link to the podcast. So I really appreciate it. That's going to do it for me here. I'll be back tomorrow at 2 p.m. Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.